Chief Daniel Morrison had fought California wildfires for 25 years, commanding elite hotshot crews through the state's worst fire seasons. When the California Department of Forestry assigned Miguel Reyes, a Filipino firefighter who'd recently transferred from the Philippine Bureau of Fire Protection to his team, Dan's skepticism was immediate. During the preseason briefing, Miguel mentioned his experience with controlled burns and traditional fire management techniques from the Philippines. Dan cut him off. "Reyes, I appreciate your experience, but California wildfires aren't the same as whatever brush fires you dealt with in the tropics. We're talking about firestorms that move faster than you can run, temperatures that melt metal, winds that create their own weather systems. We use science, data, computerized fire behavior models. We don't use traditional methods or folk wisdom. Is that understood?" Miguel nodded respectfully. "Yes, Chief, I understand." But Dan wasn't finished. "I saw in your file you have experience with something called kaingin / burn agriculture. That's exactly the kind of reckless fire management that creates problems. We're professionals here. We don't play with fire. We control it through discipline, training, and modern firefighting science." What Dan didn't understand was that Miguel's reckless kaingin experience represented generations of Filipino knowledge about fire behavior in dense vegetation. In the Philippines, controlled burning wasn't reckless, which sophisticated land management developed over centuries by farmers who understood fire dynamics at an intimate level. Miguel had learned from his grandfather how fire moves through different vegetation, how wind and terrain create unpredictable behavior, how to read smoke and flame to predict fire movement. But he said nothing, just nodded and joined the crew. The season started normally. Small fires, quickly contained, textbook operations. Dan's crew worked with precision using satellite data, weather models, and coordinated aerial support. Miguel performed competently but quietly, never mentioning his traditional knowledge again. Then came the Henderson Fire. It started small, a lightning strike in dense chaparral on a September afternoon, but conditions were catastrophic. Humidity at 8%, temperatures at 105 degrees, winds gusting to 40 miles per hour. Within 2 hours, the fire had exploded to 15,000 acres and was moving toward a residential area with terrifying speed. Dan's crew was deployed to cut a firebreak on a ridge, the plan being to stop the fire before it reached the homes below. They worked efficiently, cutting brush and creating a defensible line. The fire behavior models predicted they had for hours before the fire reached their position, but the models were wrong. The fire, driven by erratic winds and feeding on bone-dry vegetation, suddenly shifted direction. What should have been for hours became 30 minutes. "All units, this is command. Fire has jumped the canyon. It's moving directly toward your position at estimated 4 miles per hour. You need to evacuate immediately." Dan looked at the approaching wall of flame, then at the narrow dirt road they'd used to access the ridge. That road was now cut off. Fire had already swept across it. They were trapped on the ridge, with fire approaching from 2 directions, pushed by winds that were getting stronger. "Command, this is Morrison. Our access road is blocked. We're cut off." Dan's voice was steady, but his mind was racing through options. Deploy fire shelters, emergency tent-like devices that might protect them if the fire passed quickly. But the fuel load was heavy here, and the fire would burn hot and long. The shelters might not be enough. They could try to outrun it, but the terrain was rough, and the fire was moving faster than they could travel. Dan had trained for this scenario, but never actually faced it. His crew of 8 firefighters looked to him for answers he didn't have. Miguel spoke quietly. "Chief, request permission to speak." Don turned, frustration and fear making his voice sharp. "Reyes, unless you have a helicopter in your pocket, I don't have time," Miguel interrupted firmly but respectfully. "Chief, I know a way out, but we have to move now, and you have to trust me." Don stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Miguel pointed to an area of lighter vegetation, downslope. "We set a backfire, intentionally burn out that area downslope, create a burned zone with no fuel. Then we move into the burned area. The main fire will have nothing to burn when it reaches us. It will go around. In Philippines, we call this fighting fire with fire. It's how we survive when trapped." Dan's training screamed. This was insane. You want to light more fire when we're already trapped. That's exactly the kind of reckless. The roar of the approaching fire was now audible, drowning out his words. They had maybe 15 minutes. Miguel's eyes were intense. Chief, in Kaingin, we learned to control fire in high winds, steep terrain, dense fuel. I know how to set a backfire that will burn toward the main fire, creating safe zone without spreading out of control. Your models say this is reckless. My grandfather's experience says this is survival. You have to choose now. Every instinct Dan had told him not to let a firefighter intentionally light a fire in these conditions, but looking at the approaching inferno and his trapped crew, his instincts were also telling him they were about to die. Do it. But if this goes wrong, Miguel was already moving. If it goes wrong, we die anyway. At least this gives us chance. Miguel moved with startling confidence, selecting a specific point to ignite, based on factors Dan couldn't see: the exact wind direction, the slope angle, the vegetation density, the distance to the main fire. He used a drip torch to create an ignition line, then stepped back. The backfire caught and began burning upslope toward the main fire, driven by the same winds pushing the wildfire toward them. For a terrifying moment, Dan thought Miguel had killed them all. The backfire was spreading, creating more flame, more smoke. But then he saw what Miguel understood: the backfire was moving away from them, toward the main fire, consuming the fuel in a widening zone. Miguel directed the crew to move behind the advancing backfire, into the area already burned. Stay close to the burned area. Let our fire do the work. Within 10 minutes, they were standing in a zone of blackened ground, small flames still flickering around them, but the heavy fuel consumed. And then the main fire arrived. It hit the edge of their burned zone like a wave hitting a breakwater. With no fuel to burn, it split around them, roaring past on either side with terrifying intensity. The heat was brutal, the smoke choking, but they were alive, standing in an island of burned ground while the firestorm swept past. The radio crackled. "Morrison, this is command. Do you copy? We've lost your GPS signal. What's your status?" Dan looked around at his crew, alive, covered in ash but safe, standing in a circle of burned ground that Miguel's reckless technique had created. "Command, this is Morrison. All crew safe. We survived, using an indigenous firefighting technique, requesting extraction when the fire passes." Later, after they'd been helicoptered out and debriefed, Don found Miguel. "Reyes, I called your methods reckless. I dismissed your traditional knowledge as primitive. You saved 8 lives today using techniques I refuse to respect. I owe you an apology, and more than that, I need to learn what you know." Miguel smiled tiredly. "Chief, your science is good. Your training is excellent. But fire is older than science. In Philippines, we've been living with fire for thousands of years, in agriculture, in forests, in villages. We learned through necessity and sometimes through tragedy. My grandfather taught me that fire is not your enemy or your tool. It's a force you must understand and respect. Today, I used fire like he taught me, not to control it, but to work with it, redirect it, use its own energy against itself." Dan shook his head in wonder. "I've been fighting fires for 25 years. I thought I understood fire behavior. But what you did today, reading the terrain, the vegetation, the wind, in ways that aren't in any of our models, that was mastery I didn't know existed." The incident report Dan filed caused shockwaves through California firefighting agencies. His detailed account of how traditional Filipino fire management techniques had saved his trapped crew challenged standard protocols. Some officials called it dangerous luck, but others recognized something important: that indigenous knowledge about fire, developed over generations in fire-prone environments, might contain wisdom that modern fire science had overlooked. Within a year, CAL FIRE invited Filipino forestry experts to present traditional fire management techniques. Miguel became an instructor, teaching American firefighters about controlled burning, reading fire behavior through observation rather than just models, and using fire to fight fire in emergency situations. The techniques weren't adopted wholesale. They were carefully studied, tested, and integrated with modern firefighting science. Dan became Miguel's strongest advocate, co-teaching courses on indigenous fire knowledge. "I spent 25 years thinking modern firefighting science had all the answers," he'd tell classes. "Then I got trapped on a ridge with no way out, and a Filipino firefighter used reckless primitive techniques to save our lives. Turns out, thousands of years of surviving fire taught the Philippines things our decades of fire science hadn't figured out yet. The best firefighting isn't modern or traditional, it's understanding both." 3 years later, During another catastrophic fire season, a Cal Fire crew used Miguel's backfire technique to save themselves when cut off from escape routes. The technique worked again and again. What had been dismissed as reckless became recognized as advanced fire management, not to replace modern methods but to supplement them in situations where models and equipment weren't enough. Miguel eventually rose to battalion chief, training the next generation in both modern fire science and traditional fire wisdom. And Dan kept a photo in his office, his crew standing in a circle of burned ground, surrounded by blackened earth, alive because someone he'd called reckless had understood fire better than all his models and training combined. The American fire chief who'd dismissed Filipino methods now teaches them to every crew he trains, starting each class with the story of the day he was trapped on a ridge and learned that sometimes the oldest knowledge is the most advanced if you're humble enough to listen before the fire forces you to learn. Asterisk, character count, 8,998, asterisk.